Okay, so last time we just covered some basics, just terminology, and just some motivation for why we cover the various topics that we cover in this class. In particular, the things that you might see on a test that we covered last time were things like confidentiality and integrity. You should know those definitions by heart. So what is confidentiality? That is no unauthorized reading of data. Okay, you don't want people to read the data who are not supposed to be able to read it. Integrity, what do we mean by that? That would be nice, but we probably need to soften that a little bit and say we want to detect unauthorized writing. Okay, it's a subtle difference, but it is an important difference. We can't really hope to prevent unauthorized writing. We just hope to be able to detect that something is incorrect with this data, that the data lacks integrity. Okay, so the first major or first real chapter in the book is chapter 2, and this is first chapter on cryptography. We have a really large section here on cryptography, and I would say this is probably the most challenging material of the semester, so you really need to be prepared and get off to a good start for the semester. Okay, so the goal of this first chapter is a couple of things. First, we want to get some terminology. We need some basic terminology that we will use for cryptography throughout the semester. And also we want to look at a handful of classic crypto systems. Okay, the reason we look at these classic ciphers is because, believe it or not, when we look at modern ciphers, they use a lot of the same principles. Okay, so we will look at these ciphers and we will point out certain principles that we will see again and again when we look at the real world ciphers in the next 2 chapters after this. Okay, so terminology. Here we go. Cryptology is the art and science of making and breaking secret codes. Okay, so both parts, making and breaking codes, is covered in cryptology. Cryptography is the making part. Cryptanalysis is the breaking part. Now, that's technically correct, but I'll probably get sloppy and I'll say cryptography when I mean cryptology. Cryptology sounds like some medical procedures, and I don't really like that word, so I say cryptography. And you just sort of have to get from context, but typically I mean everything, cryptography. And I'll probably even shorten it more and say crypto. Okay, so from context, it should be clear what we're talking about. Okay, but technically those are the terms. Okay, we have a cipher or a crypto system that we use to encrypt the plain text. So that's a lot of words right there. Okay, cipher or a crypto system, we encrypt and we start with plain text and we get ciphertext. Okay, so plain text is just what it says. It's plain, anyone can read it. Okay, everyone knows what the plain text is. We assume that anybody can read that. We want to take this plain text, we want to convert it into ciphertext, which only the intended recipient can read. Okay, so this is a confidentiality problem, right? We want to prevent Trudy from being able to read the ciphertext, read the plain text, so we convert it to ciphertext. All right. And the result of the encryption is ciphertext. We have to be able to go in the opposite direction or your cipher is not going to be very popular. Okay, you have to be able to take the ciphertext, convert it back into plain text. Okay, and that's the decryption process. We'll use a key to configure the system. Okay, so that's the sort of secret part. Nobody's supposed to know the key. If you know the key, you can recover the plain text from the ciphertext. Now, there's 2 types of keys that show up in these systems. One is a symmetric key. The symmetry here means that the key is the same for both the sender and the receiver, or the encryptor and the decryptor. Okay, there's just one key involved, right? And every classic cipher we will talk about, every cipher that anybody knew about for thousands of years when people were doing cryptography, every cipher was a symmetric key cipher. Okay, so these are the ones you sort of think of when you think of ciphers. Okay, you encrypt, you use a key. Anybody who knows that key can decrypt and get back the plain text from the ciphertext. Okay, and that's the ciphers that we will look at today are all symmetric key ciphers. So again, the symmetry is that it's the same key. But it is possible, and this was only discovered like in the 1970s, that you could have a cipher where there's 2 keys. There's one key to encrypt and there's a different key to decrypt. These sometimes go by the name asymmetric ciphers, okay, because there's an asymmetry there, but we will use the term public key systems or public key cryptography. Why do we call it public key cryptography? I mean, think about it. If there's two keys, one to encrypt and one to decrypt, I can take that key that's used to encrypt and I can make it public. If I have a key pair, public-private key pair that I know, okay, I can take my public key and I can put it on my website. Anybody who wants to encrypt a message can go to my website, get my public key, encrypt a message, send it to me, and I'm the only one who can decrypt it because I have the private key that goes with it. Got that? Public, private. As long as I keep the private key private, I'm the only one who can decrypt that message. Okay, this actually turns out to be a pretty big deal because if you have a symmetric key system, well, somehow or another, you have to agree on that key before you can do anything, right? And how do you agree on that key without anybody else knowing that key, right? And that's a whole nother big problem. But public key systems sort of eliminate that problem. I have the private key, nobody else has it. I put my public key out there, anybody can see it. Okay, so it solves this key distribution problem. Well, it's not quite as great as it sounds. There's some catch there, okay? There's no free lunch here, okay? But it is very useful in some cases. So we will get to public key cryptography, but it's actually a pretty challenging topic, so it'll be later on, okay? We have to go through some basic ciphers here and then symmetric key systems, and then we will eventually get to public key cryptography. Okay. Okay, crypto. What do you want to say here? We make some basic assumptions whenever we're doing anything with cryptography. And the basic assumption, the most basic assumption is that we assume that the cipher system, the system that we're using, is completely known to the attacker. In other words, they know what kind of cipher we're using. They know every detail about it, down to which version of software we're using. Okay, we assume that they know that, all right? Why do we, oh, well, okay, and only the key is secret. The key is the thing that you can't have Trudy know. Trudy knows the key, she can decrypt the ciphertext, right? Get back to plain text, the confidentiality is broken. Okay, so the key, thinking symmetric ciphers, okay, the key is the secret thing here. Oh, and I should mention, right, let's go back here. We will say symmetric key cryptography and we will say public key cryptography in this class. We never say secret key cryptography because that's ambiguous, right? Because here we have a secret, here we have a secret as well. You'll see other authors do it other ways. That's the way we do it in this class, okay? Do not say secret key cryptography in this class or I will slap you about the face. Okay, so anyway. Cryptography, we make a basic assumption that the attacker knows everything, okay? Only the key is secret. The crypto algorithms in particular are not secret. This has a name, okay? This is so important, it's got a special name. It's called Kirchhoff's principle. Kirchhoff was a French military official during World War I. And he made some observation that we should not rely on the cipher being secret. Because, hey, the enemy might overrun our position and get the cipher, right? They might get the actual machine. They were using actual machines at that time to encrypt text. What if the enemy gets that? And then they can decrypt all of our messages. So we shouldn't rely on that, okay? So we should only rely on the secrecy of the key. We should assume the attacker knows that. The attacker's gotten the machine, and it still should be secure in that case. Okay, so this is a very fundamental principle, and we will hear it again and again and again. But the question is, why do we make such an assumption? Well, what do you think? Why would we make this assumption? I mean, think about it. Wouldn't Trudy's job be much more difficult if she didn't know what cipher we're using? We want to make her life difficult, right? So why do we just give her everything and assume that she knows everything? Yeah. Well, that's the hope, right? We hope that that's the case. But why do we make this assumption? Why do we sort of make this blanket assumption? I mean, couldn't we just keep our cipher secret and then Trudy would never know and it would be way harder for her to break it? Yeah.
But plate's the worst case, so that in the case that she does somehow manage to get all of that, she still can't.
That's right. Okay, so it's sort of a worst case scenario, but I mean, practice actually has taught people that you can't keep secrets like this. I mean, it's been tried many times, and even in modern times. people violate Kirchhoff's principle. They come up with a cipher and they say, okay, we're going to keep it secret because it's going to make Trudy's job way more difficult. And, 2 weeks later, everybody knows how the cipher works. Okay, it's very hard to keep these kinds of secrets, all right? So just as a practical matter, you can't really hope to do it. So it's better, and this is what happens, okay? This actually happened in practice, okay? And we will see an example of this where a cipher was designed in secret. They didn't tell anybody, right? They're thinking they're violating this Kirchhoff's principle thing, right? They designed it in secret. They put it into millions of cell phones all over the world, and then somebody reverse engineered it, figured out how it worked, and it was weak, and they broke it. Well, wouldn't it be better to put that cipher out ahead of time and have, smart cryptographers look at it and find weaknesses before you put it into millions of cell phones? Okay, so that's kind of the motivation, right? It's the worst case scenario, and as a practical matter, you can't really keep these things secret anyway. Okay. So secret algorithms eventually get exposed, and if they're weak, you're in trouble, and secrets never remain secret, okay, forever. Yeah. Okay, so it's better to find these weaknesses beforehand. Okay, so here's kind of our generic picture of a symmetric cipher. Excuse me. So we have the plain text that goes into our cipher algorithm, whatever that algorithm is, and it's in encryption mode. We put the key in, right, and we get ciphertext coming out. That ciphertext can then be transmitted over an insecure channel. That's what that squiggly line is supposed to represent. Whoever receives this over here knows the key, right? So they put it into the same algorithm in decryption mode. Excuse me. And they get back the plain text, okay? So plain text, ciphertext, back to plain text. Okay, got the picture? Okay, so that's kind of our most generic view. Now, this is, say, Alice over here, right? And that's Bob over there, and they're communicating securely, and hopefully they get confidentiality out of this interaction. What does Trudy know in this picture? What do we assume that Trudy knows here? That's it, right? Everything except for the key. In fact, she knows how this algorithm works. She knows this is not a black box. She knows exactly what's happening inside that black box. We assume that she knows the ciphertext, right? I guess we assume she doesn't know all the plain text. If she knew all the plain text, it'd be kind of pointless. So plain text and key are the things she doesn't know. However, even the plain text, we have to assume that she may know some of the plain text. I mean, think about it. Some things you might encrypt. You might want to encrypt your email, right? Okay, so encrypt your email. Well, email has headers, right? And those headers are very stereotypical. When Trudy sees an email that's encrypted, she'll know what a bunch of the bits are underneath there because it's just header information. So as a practical matter, again, Trudy will know some of the plain text. We just don't want her to know all of it, right? The secret part of it. Okay, in this part, of course, we assume Trudy knows the ciphertext. If she couldn't get the ciphertext, there'd be no point to doing this, right? So it's assumed she gets that. She knows the inner working. She knows basically everything in the picture except the key and some of the plain text, all right? Okay, so now that's kind of our definitions. Now on to classic ciphers. Okay, let's start with the simplest cipher, which is the simple substitution cipher. Okay, so the simplest, this comes in a few different forms, okay, and so this is kind of the simplest form of the simple substitution cipher. So what we will use as the key is just a shift of the alphabet. Okay, in this case, we've just shifted the alphabet over 3 positions. So every time we see one of these plain text letters, we just go down here and substitute the corresponding ciphertext letter. So for example, if you see this ciphertext here, everything was shifted by 3 positions. Okay, and this shift by 3 has a special name. It's usually referred to as a Caesar cipher because it's named after the famous salad. It's a Caesar salad cipher. Right? Okay, no, Caesar cipher is in the Roman dictator Julius Caesar. And supposedly they actually used this and it worked. I guess people didn't understand cryptanalysis very well at that time, but it was used. And of course, it'd be Latin instead of English. But anyway, they use this sort of approach. Excuse me. Okay, so if we have this and we know it's a shift by 3, how do we decrypt? we shift the other direction by 3, right? So we don't really need this whole table, but it makes it easier to do on a slide. So we would look up I, and that's F. We would look up R, and that's N. Look up I, and that's F. We'll look up R, and that's O. Okay, I like that better. Okay, so what do we get here? What was I again? F-O, I don't know. You get something here. Okay, so just shift everything by 3. Now, yeah, okay, so suppose we know that this is a Caesar cipher. If we know it's a Caesar cipher, we know how to encrypt, we know how to decrypt. It's just a shift by 3 in this case. Okay, so if we get this particular ciphertext, what does it translate to? If we shift back 3 positions, we get an S. I look at S here, we get an SP. Okay, SP. The next letter is R. We get an O, SPO. Okay, SpongeBob SquarePants. Okay, so anyway,
Professor,
yeah.
could you go back to the
Sure.
black box one?
This one?
Yeah. So if Trudy is able to see everything inside the encryption, is that not just the key? Like,
She knows what's in there in the sense of how the algorithm works. She knows the algorithm. She has the software that implements that algorithm. But the key is typically in a modern cipher, the key is just some random string of bits. So the key gets fed in, and that's how the cipher text, plain text, is encrypted for that particular case.
So the following example, it's like she'd know that the encryption is like shifting forward or backwards, but she wouldn't know by how much.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's a good example. So the Caesar cipher is a shift cipher. Sometimes they mean a shift by 3, but that's too restrictive. We'll say a Caesar cipher is any shift of the alphabet. So if you know it's a Caesar cipher, you know it's some shift of the alphabet, but you don't know exactly which one.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so again, SpongeBob SquarePants. Okay. Okay, so for example, we can have other shifts of the alphabet. In this case, we have a shift by 7. Okay, so we could encrypt, we could decrypt, and the key in this case is just the shift. All you got to tell the other side is, Alice and Bob just have to agree on what is the shift in this particular case, assuming they're using a Caesar cipher. Okay, got that? Caesar cipher shift. Okay, so let's suppose you are Trudy now, and you know Alice and Bob are using a Caesar cipher, a shift by N of the alphabet. You see a ciphertext message. How are you going to break that message? Try them all, right? I mean, how many keys are there? There's only 26, and one of them's not very good. Okay, so there's only 26 shifts of the alphabet, and so you could literally try them all, right? Now, on average, if you did this a bunch of different times, how many would you have to try before you expect to find the correct key?
13.
Half of them, right? Okay, because you're just trying them at random, so once you get through half, you expect the probability is greater than 1/2. That's what expect means. Okay, the probability is greater than 1/2 that you would have stumbled across the correct key. All right, so it's always half the number of possible keys that you expect that you need to try before you solve the problem. Now, in this case, suppose you get this particular ciphertext, you would try all 26 keys. We'll call this, we have to have a fancy name for everything in cryptography, so we'll call this an exhaustive key search. Okay, trying them all is an exhaustive key search. And we can always do this, right? There are just a finite number of keys. We can list the number of keys in a big list, and we just start going through trying each key until we see if we find one that works. Okay, so you can always do this for any cipher except maybe one we'll talk about later. Okay, so anyway, exhaustive key search. In this case, the shift is 4, so you start at the beginning, you wouldn't go very far, but it could have been 21 or something, right? So depends on what order you choose them in. Okay, so everybody got that? Exhaustive key search. We can always do this on any practical cipher. Okay, okay, so, but there's a more general case for the simple substitution. It does not have to be a shift, right? We can, in fact, use any permutation of the alphabet down here as a key. What is a permutation? What does that mean? How do you define permutation? It's a rearrangement, right? So it's a reordering of the alphabet. So any reordering of the alphabet here will work as a key. That means every letter's in there, but every letter is only in there once, right? You don't repeat anything, you don't leave anything out. As long as you do that, you have a key for a simple substitution. It will work. Okay, when you do that, there are this many keys, right? Because you just think about your basic probability. There's 26 choices here, 25 choices here, 24 choices here, and so on. And there's that many different keys. So how do we read this? How do you say that?
Factorial.
I say it 26. Okay. Math humor is not my specialty. Okay, so anyway, 26 factorial. We like to put things in terms of bits because later keys will literally be strings of bits, okay? So in this case, that's actually a pretty big number. 2 to the 8 is bigger than 2 to the 88. So it's like an 88-bit key, okay? And even modern ciphers often don't use keys much bigger than that or even that size. Okay, so that's a lot of possible keys. So that means if someone is using a simple substitution cipher, right, and it's an arbitrary permutation, could be any permutation of the alphabet, you can't try them all, okay? 2 to the 88 different keys, you have to try half of those. Half of those is how many? Half of 2 to the 88 is? 2 to the 87. Don't say 2 to the 44. 2 to the 87, right? Okay, half of the possible keys is 2 to the 87. That's a huge number. Put in your Java program for I equals 0 to 2 to the 87. Well, the sun will burn out before you finish that loop, right? I mean, you can't do it. Okay, you can't test that many possible keys. Okay, so does that mean this cipher is secure? We can use this cipher in practice? Wow. That's pretty simple cipher. Well, okay, let's suppose we have a ciphertext. And we know this ciphertext, Kirchhoff's principle, we know it was produced using a simple substitution cipher, but we don't know the key. And the key can be any arbitrary permutation. What are you going to do? We can't try them all. It's too big a number. So we got to be smarter. So what's a smarter thing to do here?
You could look at repeated letters, one after the other.
Okay, you could look for patterns, right? Yeah, you could certainly do that. What else might you do here?
The most common letter is E, so I tried to figure out.
There we go. Okay, I mean, there's a reason why you pay extra for an E on Wheel of Fortune, right? So Wheel of Fortune still exists. I don't know. So anyway, because it's the most common letter. It's by far the most common letter. So you can use the statistics of English, assuming the underlying text is English, right, and all that, and it roughly follows the usual statistics. E is just way up here. It's almost 13% of all the letters are E. So how do we use that to help us solve this message back here?
Figure out which letter shows up the most.
Yeah, these don't change, right? Okay, the letters are fixed, right? So we just relabeled E. We called it something else. We can figure out what it is by just looking at what's the most common letter in the ciphertext itself. I mean, assuming you have a reasonable amount of ciphertext and all that. And then after that, well, it gets a little bit trickier, right? Because, A and T are similar, and these are close enough, for a smaller message. They're going to look kind of similar. You might get some, but you can start picking it apart, sort of one letter at a time. So if we do that, we do frequency counts here. We find which letter is most common here in the ciphertext? Yeah, I think it's F. Okay, so F with 51, it shows up 51. Well, that's most likely E, right? So we have an E there, we have an E there, and so on. If you look at P and B, right, P is pretty common and B is pretty common. Oh, well, maybe it's like the, that first word, I don't know, you can make guesses, right? And then you can look for patterns and so on and so forth. So you can sort of pick it apart, kind of one letter at a time. E is probably easy to get. The others, you have to do a little bit more work. Okay, so in principle, we can break this for, a lot less work than 2 to the 87, trial decryptions, right? So, okay, so everybody got the picture. Use some statistical analysis of the ciphertext. It's going to help us to break the message. Okay, some terminology. We will say that a crypto system is secure. Here's our definition of a secure cipher. If the best known attack is an exhaustive search. Okay, the best known attack that anybody knows to break this cipher is to use, just brute force. Just go through the keys until you find one that works. Okay, I didn't make up this definition. There's a common definition, but it's actually kind of weird if you think about it. Okay, if you were to do a simple substitution, a Caesar cipher, let's say, which we know is a shift, right? What's the best attack if you know it's a shift cipher? Try them all. There's nothing better than that, right? Okay, try all 26 possible keys and you'll find the correct one after 13 tries on average. Okay, so by our definition, that cipher is secure. Okay, on the other hand, if you have a simple substitution that is any arbitrary permutation of the alphabet, well, you can sort of pick it apart, but that's a lot more work than 13 tries. I mean, you'll get a chance to do this in the homework. It's a lot more work than 13 tries to just decrypt, trial decrypt a message. Okay, so that's actually much harder to break in practice, but it's much faster than an exhaustive search. So by that definition, a simple substitution with arbitrary permutation is insecure, right? Okay, even though it's harder to break, it's insecure. So why would we define it this way? There must be a rationale or a reason for doing this. And the reason is your cipher can never be more secure than the number of possible keys. The exhaustive search is always a plausible attack. You can always do that. You can list all the possible keys and start trying them. Okay, so if you have an attack that's a shortcut, cryptographers hate that, okay, because that shows there's sort of an inherent weakness in the algorithm itself. All right, so what this means is in practice, you really have to consider two things. You want your cipher to be secure in this sense, but you also want there to be a huge number of possible keys. Okay, you really need both of those, right? Because we always know an exhaustive search is possible. So we have to have a large number of keys so that exhaustive search is computationally infeasible. And then we want this because we don't want a flaw in the underlying algorithm. Okay, we want it to meet its sort of advertised level of security. Okay, so got that? It's a little bit weird definition, but that's a very standard definition. Okay, got that? Two things if you're using a practical cipher. We want it to be secure in this definition, and we also want it to have a large number of possible keys. All right? Okay, next classic cipher I want to mention is the so-called Vigenère cipher. And the simple substitution is known as a monoalphabetic substitution, meaning the alphabet doesn't change. There's just one substitution, it's fixed, right? This is a simplest example of a polyalphabetic substitution, meaning that substitution changes. So what a Vigenère cipher really is just a series of Caesar ciphers. Okay, it's a series of shift ciphers put together. All right. Okay, and the way you determine the shift, or the way you remember the shift, is to use a keyword. So for example, if the keyword is cat, that means first position we shift by 2, second position we shift by 0, third position we shift by whatever t is, I think it's 19. Okay, so 2, 0, 19. And then of course our message could be more than 3 letters, so we would just repeat cat over and over and over. Okay, okay, so for example, if we have the keyword is cat, right, and the message we want to encrypt is attack at dawn, we would shift by 2, right? We would shift by shift by 0, sorry, shift by 19, and it's circular, right? Shift back around off the end, and just keep going, right? 2, 0, 19, 2, 0, 19. So it's a series of simple shift ciphers, all right? And how would you decrypt? Shift in the opposite direction. Okay, and what's the key here? Key is just the key word, right? Because you know how the cipher works. As long as someone tells you the key word, you can encrypt and you can decrypt, right? How about if you're Trudy and you see a Vigenère cipher? You know it's a Vigenère cipher and you see the ciphertext. How do you break it? It's actually kind of challenging. It's kind of interesting. I think maybe you'll see a homework problem on this, so I don't want to say too much, but it's kind of interesting. The trick is to find the length of the keyword. Once you know the length of the keyword, it's relatively simple because they're just shifts, right? There aren't too many choices. But finding the length of the keyword is actually a little bit tricky, okay? Once you do that, you're in pretty good shape. Okay, so that's a polyalphabetic substitution, more than one alphabet, more than one, shift or one permutation used. Okay, another completely sort of different type of classic cipher is the so-called double transposition. And I should mention, if you look up the double transposition online, you won't be quite like this. This is sort of a simplified version of a double transposition because I just want to illustrate the key point here. We don't really need it to be as strong as possible. Okay, so this is kind of a simplified or slightly dumbed down version of a double transposition. Okay, let's suppose our message again is attack at dawn. We put X's in there to represent spaces in this case, just for the fun of it. So we put that into a matrix. And let's suppose we choose a matrix that's 5 rows and 3 columns. Okay, so we just put the message in there, attack at dawn. All right, and if we have space at the end, we just put X's because they represent spaces. Okay, so it didn't quite fit, but close enough. So attack at dawn. And then the key will be a permutation of the rows and a permutation of the columns. So double permutation, right? Double transposition. Okay, in this case, we chose the permutation to be 1, 3, 2 of the columns and 3, 5, 1, 4, 2 of the rows. So just rearrange the rows, rearrange the columns of this original matrix, and then just read out the message, right? Just read out the message the same way you put it in, and attack at dawn becomes this gibberish here. Okay, so can you decrypt this if you know the key? If you know the key, well, what is the key?
The way the rows and columns are shuffled.
Key is the size of the matrix and then the permutations, right? So if you know that information, you just put it into this matrix, right? It would look like this. And then you unscramble the rows to get back here, and you read it out and you get back the plain text message. So if you know the key, it's very easy to encrypt, very easy to decrypt. If you don't know the key, you're Trudy, can you break this message? Well, it's a little bit different, right? Because all the letters are right there, right? It's not like we substituted for the letters. They're just sitting there staring us in the face, right? We just have to sort of unscramble them. And so that's a different process, okay? I won't say any details because I think maybe again, there's a homework question, but you can think about that. How would you go about trying to break this message if you're Trudy and you don't have the key? Oh, excuse me. Okay, now on to the two most interesting of the classic ciphers we want to spend some time on. The first here is the so-called one-time pad. Now, for this cipher, I want to do things in terms of bits, all right? To keep it simple, let's assume we have an alphabet with just 8 letters, okay? We're only going to have 8 letters, and I'm going to convert the letters into bits, all right? And the way that I convert letters into bits is this. And this is not secret. Everybody knows this. This is like the ASCII code or EBCDIC or something. This is just a way that you convert letters into bits. So that's known, all right? Okay, so let's just come up with, and the way we're going to encrypt here is we're going to take our message, whatever it is, convert it into bits. We're going to have a key, which is the same length as the message and just a random looking string of bits, and we just XOR the bits. You know how to XOR bits, right? Well, you'll see here in a second how to XOR bits. Okay, so it's just XOR, and that's all that means there is XOR. You XOR the plain text with the key to get the ciphertext, and we'll see magically you XOR the ciphertext with the same key and you get back the plain text. It's like magic. Okay, but to talk about this one, let's come up with this scenario here. Okay, where might this make sense? Well, let's suppose this World War II. Okay, so during World War II, there's a German spy working in the British government, right? And this spy wants to send a message back to Hitler, right? To Berlin. So he creates this message, and it says, starts off Heil Hitler, of course, right? Don't want to make him mad. Heil Hitler. And so to encrypt this message, he's going to use a one-time pad. So he has this key, and whoever is going to receive this message also has the key. They've agreed on that ahead of time, right? Okay. So he takes the message and just converts it into bits. You know, H right here is 001, E is 000, and so on. So just convert it into bits. This is the key that they've agreed on. So just take the key and XOR the bits. right? You know how to XOR, right? It's just like addition, right? 0 plus 1 is 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 1 plus 0. Do I have a 1 plus 0 is 1? Okay, so it's commutative. 0 plus 1, 1 plus 0. 0 plus 0. But the trick is 1 plus 1 is 0, right? I try to teach my kids this, 1 plus 1 is 0, and they thought I was crazy. Yeah, but that's addition mod 2 or XOR, right? 1 plus 1 is 0. Okay, so you just XOR those two together to get 0. Okay, so everybody got that? XOR. Okay, so when you do the XOR, you get this down here, and that's the encryption process. Now we can convert those back to letters. And if we do that, we get this gibberish down here, right? So this is what is sent. You would send this. And the other side, how would they decrypt this? Well, I claim they could just take this ciphertext and XOR exactly the same key in, and they would get back the message they started with. How is that possible? Why does that work? It's the magic of the XOR. If you XOR the same thing with itself, you always get 0. Okay, and think about it. You XOR 0 with 0, you get 0. You XOR 1 with 1, you get 0. So what happens here is you've XORed the key into the plain text twice. When you XOR the key with itself, it just goes away and you're back to the plain text. Okay, so let's just see if that actually works. Okay, so here's the ciphertext. Here's the key. You're going to have to trust me, I guess. I put the same key. I didn't cheat. Put the same key in here. We XOR. We get back the original message. Okay, we will see this again and again. Okay, so make peace with the XOR. Okay, the XOR function, you XOR twice, it goes away. That's actually a very useful property that shows up in modern ciphers. All right? Okay, so this spy, this British spy, could encrypt the message, send it back. As long as they both have the key, ahead of time, they can encrypt, they can decrypt. Now, let's make this scenario more interesting. Let's suppose that this spy, the British, they suspect this person's a spy. And so they see this person sending these gibberish-like messages to Berlin. They say, oh, okay, there's something going on here. Okay, this doesn't look right. And so they take this spy who sent this message. They have the message, they have the spy, but they don't know the key, right? So they do some, rubber hose cryptanalysis. They take the spy and start beating him with a rubber hose till he tells them the key. And, he says, okay, I give up. Here's the key. But he makes up a key. This is not the actual key. He gives them an incorrect key. But, they know how a one-time pad works. So they take the key, the key, it's not the correct key. This was the actual ciphertext they had. Take the key and they XOR it with the message, and they get kill Hitler. And they say, oh man, this guy must be working for us, and they let him go. Or, if you gave him a different key, this is a different key from the previous blue key, he gets he likes Ike. Well, he's a good one too, right? So it's not Heil Hitler, at least. So what's going on here? It's kind of weird. What's happening here is that you can, by the choice of key here, you can produce any message with whatever it is, 10 letters. You can make it say anything by just giving me a key, that matches, right? That gives me that particular output. So, okay, well, that's kind of weird. So let's think about what we said about exhaustive key search, right? Remember exhaustive key search? You try all possible keys. What would happen here if you try all possible keys?
You get a lot of statements that make sense, but it might not be the right one.
You not only get a lot, you get all possible messages of whatever it is, 10 letters, right? You get every possible 10-letter message. So which one's right? You have no way to know. Okay, so this is very nice property if you are designing a cipher. This is ideal. It means that the ciphertext itself provides no information about the plain text. If you give somebody the ciphertext, they can try exhaustive searching over keys forever and ever, and they will never know which one is correct unless they have some other information. But just from the ciphertext, they will never know which key is correct. Okay, so this is actually provably secure. You can write down a rigorous proof this is secure in the sense that the ciphertext provides no information about the plain text. We will not see any other cipher in this class that has this property. Okay, modern ciphers that are used in practice, public key, symmetric key, whatever, do not have this provable security property. Okay, so this is a very strong property. It's something very nice to have in a cipher. So it's provably secure in the sense, again, ciphertext provides no information about the plain text. And that's because if you choose that key at random, all plain texts are equally likely. You know, it could have been any one of them. You have no information about which one is correct. But, and of course there's a big but, right? Okay, but you have to use the cipher correctly. Okay, what does it mean to use the one-time pad correctly? Why is it called one-time pad after all? Well, the key, or sometimes they call it a pad, okay, the key has to be chosen at random. Okay, you have to choose those bits at random. If there's a pattern there, someone could figure that out and break the message more easily. And the key has to, of course, only be known to the sender and receiver, right? That's typical, that's true of every symmetric cipher. Okay, so the key has to be known only to Alice and Bob, or sender and receiver. And there's even a kind of worse thing here. If you think about it, the key itself, right? That pad is the same size as the message, right? Because we XOR every bit, right? So we have to have a key that's the same size as the message. Well, okay, so let's put this together. We have a key that's the same size as the message. The key is known only to the sender and receiver. So that means sender and receiver have to agree on the key, right? They have to do this in a way that Trudy doesn't know what the key is. If they can do that, why don't they just send the message that way? It's the same size, right? Right? Okay, so it seems kind of weird that anybody would ever use this cipher, a one-time pad, right? And the problem really is this right here. The key is the same size as the message. We have to securely distribute this key, which is the same size as our message, before we can communicate. If we can do that, we can securely distribute that key. Why not just skip the encryption entirely and just distribute the message to start with, right? Everybody see the catch here, sort of a catch-22 kind of thing going on here? Okay, so why not just distribute the message, forget the cipher, we can do it securely, we're done. Well, okay, it could actually make sense, okay, in some cases to use a one-time pad. And this is this Project Venona. You can go to the NSA website, I think it's still there. This was Soviet spies in the United States from the 30s through the 50s, okay, used this one-time pad cipher. And in this case, it actually made sense, right? Because when the spy would come into the US, they would bring with them the one-time pad, right? They bring a long, book filled with zeros and ones, right? Now you get stopped at customs going through with a book filled with zeros and ones. They might think you're kind of weird, but they'll let you go through, right? Okay, so now you have this long string of zeros and ones, and you can use that to encrypt your message, what you send back to Moscow, right? So spies could use this one-time pad, and it's provably secure. What's better than that? You can't get better than that. Okay, so it actually made sense to use a one-time pad in this case. However, and this dealt with a lot of things, nuclear espionage during World War II and so on. So the spies would carry the one-time pad with them, and they were actually well trained. They knew what to do. They would use the one-time pad, and then they would use it only once. If you repeat it, that's a weakness as well. So they would use it once, and they did everything correctly. However, a lot of these messages were broken. They were broken because, this is like pre-computer age, right? And you're trying to generate a long string of random bits, random zeros and ones. Their random bit generation thing wasn't very random. So there would be repeats. So the key was repeated. When you repeat the key, that gives you sort of two looks at it, and then you can sort of figure out which ones are correct and which ones are not. Okay, so you can break it if the keys are repeated. That's why it's a one-time pad, right? So anyway, there was a lot of cryptanalytic work done on this because they consider, they had to be important messages that were being sent by spies, during this time period. And so here's an example from 1944. Okay, so what was happening in the 1940s? 1944? World War II. Okay, so this is sort of at the height of World War II, late in the war. And this was a Project Venona message that was sent encrypted with a one-time pad and was broken by US cryptanalysts. Okay, if you read this, I don't know, it's talking about somebody working on Project Enormous, whatever that might be. And then they use and it was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they use like cover names for a lot of the people. But they slip up once in a while and put the actual name in. So, but they have cover names, Volok, Fellow Countryman, and so on, and Liberal, and Chester. And from context and various other cases, sometimes where they made mistakes and so on. Here it was known that Ruth, they actually put a name in here, Ruth, was Ruth Greenglass, and Liberal was Julius Rosenberg, and Enormous was the Manhattan Project, right, the atomic bomb. So what the upshot of this is that the Soviets actually had spies, at the Manhattan Project, giving them information on what was happening. So they weren't surprised, when Truman told them he had this big bomb he was going to use. He was shocked. Why weren't they surprised? Because they knew. Anyway, this is a name maybe you recognize, Julius Rosenberg. Anybody know why he's famous?
Wasn't he and his wife Ethel Rosenberg executed?
Yeah, they were executed as Soviet spies shortly after World War II, and one of the few cases where that actually happened. And Greenglass, anybody know this name in terms of Soviet espionage? Yeah, so this Ruth, her husband was working on the Manhattan Project, and he was feeding, information to the Soviets, selling information to the Soviets. He was David Greenglass. Anybody know what happened to him? You might think so, but he actually served like a 20-year prison sentence and became like a, patent attorney in New York or something afterwards. So go figure. Anyway, so these are pretty interesting messages, and the reason they were broken again is because there was a flaw in the way that the one-time pad was generated. All right. Okay, the final classic cipher we want to look at is the codebook cipher, and this is actually exactly what it says. It's just a big book filled with codes. Okay, so you might have each word that you would possibly want to encrypt in this code book, and next to it you'd have a number. So you just take the word, you substitute the number for that word, and that's the way you encrypt the message. So what could be simpler than that? We'll talk just a minute here about the Zimmerman telegram, and this was encrypted using a codebook cipher, and this is a World War I thing, and pretty interesting, most famous case certainly of a codebook cipher. And this was a German codebook, so German words here, and they had certain numbers associated with them, just examples here from the codebook, right? Now, it may be hard to believe, but actually modern block ciphers, which are the real workhorses of cryptography today, the vast majority of bits that get encrypted in the world are encrypted with block ciphers. Modern block ciphers are actually codebook ciphers if you think about them in the right way. Okay, so this is an important concept, even though it seems trivially simple. Okay, you literally just look up in a book and get the code that you replace the word with. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that. Typically, a code book also used an additive. So there would be two books. There would be, and this is pre-computer age again. So there's literally a book filled with code words and the numbers that correspond to them. There's another book with a bunch of random-looking numbers in it. Okay, just random numbers. Okay. So when you want to encrypt a message, what you would do is you would look up each word in your message, get the corresponding number from the code book. Then you would go to some position in the additive book. Maybe I go to position 3000 in the additive book, just randomly pick a position. And you would take a sequence of numbers from the additive book, and you would add to each of those numbers you got from the code book. Yeah?
So it's like token embedding and position embedding.
We'll talk about it. Just hold on a second, see if you still have a question. Okay, so we would do this adding thing. We would add a number to each element. Now, when we send the message to the other side, we send the ciphertext, and we also tell them where to go in the additive book. So they go to that position in the additive book, they subtract off those series of numbers, and then they look them up in the code book. Okay, got that? So there's this extra step in there of the additive. Why do we do that? Why do we have that extra step of the additive? Well, okay, so typically these things might be used by the Navy, right? So navies loved code books. So they would have these code books, these books on ships, right? Okay, now if you are a cryptanalyst, you get to see the ciphertext, right? Suppose they don't use an additive. Well, I mean, common words you would see again and again and again. You would see that number show up again and again and again. Kind of like a simple substitution cipher, right? The most common words would show up over and over, and you'd be able to figure out, oh, this word is probably the, and this word is probably and so on and so forth. You'd be able to slowly pick it apart. You would need a lot more text, right, than you do with a simple substitution cipher. There's more words, but in principle, the same attack works. But with the additive, what does that do for us? How does that help? Okay, think about it. If you have the word the, right? Okay, if you just use the code book, it would show up as the same number every time. Now, if I use that additive trick, it shows up as a different number, right? Almost every time, it's going to be a different number. So it's going to take hugely more data to get any information, any statistical information about what's happening inside the code book. Yeah.
It makes it unique.
Yeah, it makes it almost unique, right? Depends on where they start in the code book. Yeah, so it makes it so you need much more data in order to get any statistical information. So in other words, it makes the code book last much longer. Think about it. If you have to distribute this code book to every ship in your Navy, it's a pretty big deal. You want it to last a long time. And so the additive sort of extends the life of the code book. And we will see in modern block cipher, there's something corresponds to the additive, all right? Okay, but anyway, it's literally just a big book, right? You'll look up these codes in the book, right? Okay, so back to the Zimmermann telegram. Okay, so World War I don't know, they teach history anymore? I don't think so, but you know, so World War I was this thing that came before World War II. Funny how that works. And so it was Germany, you know, was fighting on its eastern front with Russia. It was fighting on the western front with France and Britain and eventually the United States. At this particular time, Zimmermann was the German foreign minister, right? So he's in Berlin. And the U.S. had not entered the war, but you know, the British and French, of course, wanted the U.S. to enter the war because they figured they'd be on their side. And things were getting kind of desperate for Germany. Okay, so they were, you know, two-front war. It was a very difficult situation. And all they really had, sort of the last card they had to play was submarines. Okay, they had these submarines, these diesel-powered submarines that they could send out and sink ships. And so they thought they would sink all these ships that were sending supplies to Britain, and you know, that would give them some hope of winning the war. But the U.S. president at the time said, you know, we believe in freedom of the seas, and we should be able to send our ships anywhere we want. And if you sink our ships, we're going to get mad, right? Okay, so don't sink our ships. And so the key word was unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans were going to start unrestricted submarine warfare because that was their last chance, right? Okay, so that's kind of the situation. All right, so in that situation, the British had, you know, there's no internet at this time, right? So there were cables, big, huge cables that ran under the ocean. And the British had tapped the cables, okay? They had literally tapped the cables, and they could read the messages that were going back and forth. And this ciphertext message was sent from German Foreign Minister Zimmermann in Berlin to his ambassador in Mexico, okay? And it's encrypted, right? That's encrypted with a codebook cipher. The British were able to break this. How do you break a codebook cipher? Well, it helps if you have the codebook, right? So, so this codebook was used by navies, right? And so a German submarine sank, I think, in the North Sea somewhere. And, you know, they knew that Germans were smart and knew that they were supposed to destroy the codebook, right? Because it was important. But you know, they didn't have time, apparently, and one codebook washed up on shore. So they had a codebook, it was damaged, but they were able to, from context, by this point in the war, they had filled in the missing parts. And so they had the codebook, and they had the additive book. They had everything, right? So they could literally decrypt this message. Okay, so what did the message say? It said, this is again the German foreign minister to his ambassador in Mexico. The U.S. is not in the war. They're trying to keep the U.S. out of the war, but they have to use their submarines, right? So it's going to be a conflict. So we intend on the 1st of February to begin unrestricted submarine warfare. They're going to sink every ship going for Britain. It's probably going to piss off the United States, right? So that's what this says. And so we want to make a proposal to Mexico. Okay, proposal of alliance. We make war together, we make peace together. And what's in it for Mexico? Mexico will get back the reconquer the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. They forgot California. Anyway, so okay, so you're the British now. You have this message. It's decrypted, right? You probably want to do what with this message? Maybe put it in the front page of the New York Times, right? You want to get the U.S. in on your side, right? This will make them mad and they'll come in on your side in the war, right? Isn't that great? Well, okay, yeah, but think about it. You have this message. If you put it on the front page of the New York Times, what's going to happen? They're going to get a new code book. They're going to know their code book is broken. So they're kind of hesitant, right, to release the message. So in this interim where they're thinking about what to do with the message, they go back and look at the cable messages that were sent, right, about this same time. And they find another one that was sent from the German foreign minister to his ambassador in Argentina. And it says almost the same thing, but it's not encrypted. So guess which one they released? So they released the one that was sent to the ambassador in Argentina because it was slightly different. And the Germans thought, hey, we should have encrypted that one. Now, why didn't the British notice that message that was not encrypted? You know, that would have saved them a lot of trouble, right? They wouldn't even had to bother to decrypt it. Why didn't they notice that till after the fact when they went back and looked more closely? Well, in fact, there's a lot of traffic on this cable, right? They can't look at everything. They only want to look at the stuff that's important. What stuff's important? Encrypted messages, right? Okay, so by sending this encrypted message, they basically put a big red flag on it. Hey, this is important, right? And since the cipher was broken, they were able to read it. So, you know, you have to be careful, right? If you're going to encrypt messages, you probably want your cipher to be really strong. Right? If your cipher's compromised, that's worse than no encryption at all, maybe. Okay? At least in this case it was. Okay, so what was the upshot here? So they released the message, you know, got the U.S. riled up, but the U.S. still did not get into the war just because of this. There was later a passenger liner, the Lusitania, was sunk, and that was kind of the fuse that set everything off. And that was pretty late in the war already anyway. Okay, so just to finish up here with a few random historical things. There's a nice timeline here. Cryptography is really an interesting area if you like the history of it. You know, there's a lot of, it's been around forever, at least in the symmetric cipher form. And I put this here because we're the Spartans. You know. So the Spartans had this cool transposition cipher thing way before the Caesar cipher. And there's this nice short story. I might assign a homework problem on this called The Gold Bug. Edgar Allan Poe, the guy who wrote The Raven and all those sort of horror things. He wrote another story which is about a pirate's buried treasure. And basically the entire story is breaking a simple substitution cipher because they have this cipher message, right? And it tells them where the pirate's treasure is buried. And it goes through the tricks you use to break a simple substitution. So it's kind of a cool story for that time period. And finally, I'd say a little bit here about the election of 1876. There was a cipher that showed up in that case too, which is kind of interesting. So let's just finish with that. Okay, so in the election of 1876, you may think all this name calling is something new in politics. No. This was like post-Civil War, and things were very contentious in the United States. And so Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden, well, they called him Rutherford Hayes and Swindling Tilden, right? And the popular vote was essentially a tie. Actually, Hayes lost by a fraction of a percent in the popular vote. But of course, in the U.S., the popular vote does not determine the president. It's the electoral vote. And the electoral vote of 4 states was disputed. And this is post-Civil War, right? So the North is basically occupying the South. And so you could see disputes arise, right, over who's, which votes are to count. And one of the states was Florida, believe it or not. It's like in 2000. So there were 4 states' votes in dispute. In 2000, when it was, again, essentially a tie, it went to the Supreme Court. Here they didn't go to the Supreme Court. They set up a separate commission, which had 15 members, which had 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. It voted 8-7 to give all those disputed votes to Hayes, and so he became president. Okay, so it was very contentious, right? I mean, obviously. And so people, the Hayes, the Tilden people, right? Tilden, the guy who lost, they immediately accused Hayes of bribery. He must have bribed these voters in those 4 states to get their votes, whatever. And so was that true? Well, ironically, a cipher, some encrypted messages showed up a couple months later. But these messages were not from Hayes, the guy who won, right? They were from Tilden to his supporters out in the field, right? From Tilden's campaign to his supporters out in the field. And this is kind of a weird cipher. It did a code book kind of thing for common words at that particular time, just substituted for those words. So for example, it used place names, right, for important words at the time. Remember, this one used Warsaw for telegram. Excuse me. And then it would take the sentence after making these substitutions and it would permute the words. Okay, and the permutation was fixed depending on the length of the sentence. So it'd be padded to a multiple of 5 words, and then a fixed permutation would be applied. This is not a very strong cipher. Reporters got a bunch of these messages, and they were able to unscramble them, using context from other, using multiple messages of the same length, and then the context gave them the codebook part. All right. And so, for example, one of the messages was this, one of the ciphertexts. Warsaw, they read all unchanged, last our idiots, can't situation. And so Warsaw was telegram. Okay, so put telegram in there, and then they have several messages, and they were able to unscramble. And this one unscrambles as transposition was figured out in this case, and can't read last telegram, situation unchanged, they are all idiots. So the upshot of this was, again, these were messages sent from Tilden's campaign to his supporters in the field. And what were they trying to do? What were these messages about? Why were they using encrypted messages? Because they were trying to bribe people, and they failed. Oh, the irony. Okay, so anyway, from a cipher point of view, it's a pretty weak cipher, and they essentially reused the key a bunch of times, which made it very weak. Okay, so that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up there next time with sort of modern history. Okay, so on to, I guess, relatively modern things. So in World War I, we did mention the Zimmermann telegram. This was the thing from the German foreign minister to the ambassador in Mexico using a codebook cipher. Okay, after World War I, the U.S. did get involved in World War I and then was on the British and French side. But after World War I, the U.S. sort of withdrew, became sort of isolationist. And so as part of that, the U.S. Secretary of State, one famous quotes, I think this is, emblazed across the entrance to the CIA or something now. It says, gentlemen do not read each other's mail. And what he meant by that, or what the practical implication of that was, is that the U.S. did not do any cryptanalytic work. Okay, so the other countries could send their messages and we would not even try to read them. Well, that seems kind of a mistake, right? Because in the build-up to World War II, the Japanese and Germans had these ciphers, and we were not reading them. And fortunately, shortly before the war, that kind of got reversed, and we started working on these ciphers. And during World War II, it was sort of amazing. I mean, all of the major Axis ciphers were broken, and many were read in real time. Okay, the Battle of Midway and Coral Sea in the Pacific. This was, I think you could, after Pearl Harbor, this was sort of a draw, right? It wasn't that the U.S. had a great victory, but it was close enough that the Japanese could never advance any further, right? So it was really a huge turning point in the war in the Pacific. And the intelligence that was gained from reading Japanese tactical ciphers was immensely valuable. The U.S. knew exactly where Japanese ships were going to be, right? And at that time, you didn't have satellites, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have any other way to know where these ships might be. So that was incredibly valuable information. The Japanese purple cipher, so-called purple cipher, was used for higher level diplomatic communications. So this is the one that was, the Japanese sent a message to their ambassador in Washington, and that message said, okay, we're going to break diplomatic relations and blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff. And you were supposed to tell them on December 8th, 1941. Okay, so the U.S. actually broke this, and they read it, and the Japanese didn't because their cipher didn't work. Okay, so that was kind of weird. They couldn't get their machine to work. And so that's where all these conspiracy theories that the U.S. knew about Pearl Harbor ahead of time and didn't do anything. But it's not really, you read the message, it doesn't say we're going to bomb Pearl Harbor, right? It just says we're going to break off diplomatic relations. Okay, there's something's happening, but it wasn't clear exactly what was happening, right? And that case is pretty interesting because the U.S. cryptanalysts who broke this cipher never saw the machine. Okay, never. They never got a hold of the machine. Even after the war, they only got pieces of the machine. So they were able to break it just literally from ciphertext. And they constructed a machine that was functionally the same as the purple cipher, and it actually used a lot of the same components that the actual cipher machine used. So that was pretty amazing cryptanalysis. The German Enigma that we'll look at here in just a second, this was, very important, as you saw in the homework. Lots of important intelligence was gained from that. And Alan Turing, the famous computer scientist, he worked on this extensively. So that was all one of the great successes he had, he was involved with. Okay, so here's the Enigma cipher, and this is certainly the most famous cipher of World War II. And it's really cool the way it works. It's an electromechanical device, right? So you press a key on the keyboard, so you're typing in the plain text. So first you set it up, right? So you set up various, you configure it in various ways. There's a bunch of rotors here. These rotors have built into them a hardwired permutation, but they rotate. Every time they rotate, that effectively gives you a different permutation. And you have a series of these rotors. So the number of possible permutations you can get is enormous. Okay, we talked about the Vigenère cipher, right? So that's a polyalphabetic substitution, meaning the permutation changes, okay? Here the permutation changes, but the number of possible permutations is huge. Okay, think of 26 letters, there's 26 factorial different permutations. You can get a huge number of possible permutations because of these rotations of the rotors. So it's a very clever design using rotors. And there were a lot of rotor cipher systems at that time. And this one's really has some really interesting features. It's its own inverse. So you set it up the same to encrypt as to decrypt. That's kind of a nice feature. It has this plug board thing down here, which is like, telephone, old-fashioned telephone plug board. You plug cables in, so on and so forth. It gets a huge number of possible additional combinations, and so on. So if you just do the math and figure out how many keys there are, I mean, it's huge. It's this vast number. Nobody's ever going to do an exhaustive search on it. But there are weaknesses, and so they were able to exploit these weaknesses and do very much shortcut attacks and things that could be done even without computers, right? Just sort of pre-computers that did search through a number of cases, but not huge numbers of possible keys. Okay, so anyway, after World War II. Claude Shannon, this guy is known as the father of information theory, and he had a paper on ciphers that was actually written during World War II but wasn't published until after. And he set a lot of the basics, a lot of the foundation for modern cryptography. I mean, prior to this time, prior to even after World War II, cryptography was really something that was only done by government and militaries. Okay, people in industry, people in academia, they didn't do cryptography. There really wasn't a need for it, right? So they just didn't do it, right? And so when you think of cryptography before World War II, it's all government and military. Even up into the 1970s, that's the case. But this is kind of the first place where somebody tries to lay sort of a scientific foundation under the field of cryptography. Before that, it's sort of just a black art. You do something and, it sort of works, right? That sort of thing. Okay, and looking forward here, the computer revolution, which really got going in the 70s, okay, that's when people realized, hey, we have data that we have to protect, right? I mean, before that, if you had medical records, where were they? They were in a filing cabinet in the doctor's office, right? So what's to protect? You just make sure the office doesn't burn down or something, right? But now that's all online. Well, then it wasn't all online, but it was all computerized. So it's all on a computer system. Someone gets that floppy disk. Wow, they have everybody's information, right? So we have to protect that somehow. And how do we protect that? Well, now we need some cryptography. We have to protect confidentiality, the integrity, and so on. Now, in the 70s, when people started to realize they need cryptography, they need to use it, there was no background knowledge of cryptography, right? Because government and military is doing it, and they're not talking. They're keeping all this stuff secret. So there's a lot of sort of people trying to sell cryptography that don't know what they're doing. So a lot of sort of snake oil kind of solutions out there. So the US government developed a standard. They proposed a standard for encryption in the 1970s. And this is really a huge watershed event in the history of cryptography. The government intended to keep it secret, the data encryption standard and all that went with it. They intended that all to be secret, the development of it, because they're government and military. They want to keep the knowledge to themselves, right, of how to develop ciphers. But it created a huge brouhaha, and people got interested in cryptography, and so had exactly the opposite of the intended effect, and we'll talk more about that later. But public key cryptography came out in the 70s, or became public knowledge in the 70s, and then there started to be academic conferences and so on and so forth. And so really, the genie's out of the bottle, and everybody is doing cryptography now, all right? So it's not just government and military. Okay, so this guy, Claude Shannon, it's worth talking about him a little bit. So again, he's the founder of this entire field of information theory, and it's lesser known, and everybody knows that, but it's a little lesser known that he's also very important in the field of cryptography. In 1949, he published this paper, Communication Theory of Secrecy Systems, and it's all about symmetric ciphers, okay? And so he lays down some fundamental concepts. And these two concepts are confusion and diffusion. So roughly speaking, what he means by confusion is that you need to obscure the relationship between the ciphertext and the plain text. Okay, you have to do this, right? Because who gets to see the ciphertext? Well, everybody gets to see the ciphertext. We assume Trudy gets the ciphertext, right? And if she can figure out what the plain text is from the ciphertext, it's not a very good cipher, okay? So you have to do something to confuse that relationship. Diffusion is a little less obvious maybe, but he says you want to take the statistics of the plain text and spread them around in the ciphertext. So, so it's not like the simple substitution where the statistics are right there, right? You spread those statistics around to make it harder. Yeah, do you have a question?
Is it like the frequency of certain words?
What's it?
Is this statistic like the frequency of certain words?
It depends on the cipher. Yeah, so we'll see what these mean in sort of modern cipher context. But and he also proved that the one-time pad is secure in the sense that the ciphertext gives you no information about the plain text, all right? So first time anybody had really written down a rigorous proof of that. So you could say the one-time pad is confusion only. It just sort of obscures the relationship between plain text and ciphertext. It doesn't really do anything directly to try to spread the statistics around. And that's provably secure, right? So apparently confusion alone is enough. But in practical ciphers, diffusion almost always plays a role as well, as we will see. Okay, so cryptography, there's sort of 3 areas in the field of cryptography, and this is the part about making ciphers, right? Okay, there are symmetric key ciphers. This symmetry again means you use the same key to encrypt as to decrypt, and the system is essentially the same for encryption and decryption. There are 2 sort of modern types of symmetric key ciphers. There are stream ciphers and block ciphers. Stream ciphers are a generalization of the one-time pad. Block ciphers are a generalization of the codebook. Okay, so we've seen these. Okay, we've seen the basic ideas here. Public key cryptography, or sometimes called asymmetric cryptography, you have 2 keys. Keys come in pairs. One is used to encrypt, one is used to decrypt. Doesn't seem like a big difference, but it's actually a huge difference because you can now take the encryption key and you can make it public. Anyone can encrypt. Only I can decrypt as long as I keep my private key private, or the decryption key private. Another thing you can do with public key cryptography, which doesn't really have an analog up here, is you can do a digital signature. So what does that mean? Well, okay, we have a key pair, right? We have a key to encrypt, we have a key that decrypts. Suppose I instead, and I keep the decryption key private. So I have a public key and a private key. Suppose I encrypt with the private key, okay? So the other keys, they work to encrypt or decrypt. Suppose I encrypt with the private key. Well, who can do the encryption? Who has the private key?
Only you.
Only me. So only I can do the encryption. Who can do the decryption with the public key? Everyone else. So this is like a signing a paper, right? I mean, in principle, I'm the only one who can sign this document. Anyone can look and see that I signed it. Okay, and it's actually better because we can verify it electronically, right? We don't have to be handwriting experts in order to make this work. Yeah.
So papers are confusing in some of the math. Do we know that the base number modulo the prime number? Do you understand that? Some of the laws.
We will. I mean, we're not covering the math here at all, right? We will look at specific systems and see how they work. Yeah, that's coming. Yeah. Okay, and then finally, there's a third category here of hash algorithms, which are sometimes treated as one-way ciphers in the sense that you can hash something, but you can't reverse it, right? Okay, so that's for different sort of problems. I don't like really thinking of those as ciphers, but sometimes they're presented that way, so they kind of fit into this category, and we need them as well for public key cryptography. Okay, how about cryptanalysis? Let's look at it, the other side of the coin. Okay, suppose you're trying to break a cipher. Okay, what about cryptanalysis? You know, what's the different ways that you can go about breaking a cipher? And here we'll think about it from the perspective of what does Trudy have available? What information is available to Trudy? Well, the worst case for Trudy is ciphertext only, right? We assume Trudy knows the ciphertext. She always gets the ciphertext. So, okay, so that's sort of the minimum amount of information that she'll have. We generally assume that Trudy can know some of the plain text, right? So we'll consider that a known plain text attack. So she gets the ciphertext. It's a hierarchy here, right? She gets the ciphertext. She knows some plain text. A step up might be chosen plain text. Trudy gets to choose which plain text is encrypted, and she gets to see the corresponding ciphertext. I mean, can that really happen, or is this just, silly fun and games? Well, in fact, it can happen, and we will see protocols where you are supposed to send the protocol a random challenge, and it will encrypt it and send it back to you. Well, that random challenge can be anything, right? So if you're Trudy, you can choose all the plain text you want and see the corresponding ciphertext. So if your cipher is weak against that kind of attack, you're going to be in trouble. Okay, so you have to think about that. maybe adaptively chosen. You look at what came out and you choose the next one. So that's kind of the same thing. There are some ciphers that are sensitive to two keys being closely related in some way. Okay, and that's maybe a little bit esoteric, but it actually comes up in one of the ciphers we will talk about. And forward search. Okay, so this one's a little bit different. This only applies to public key ciphers. Okay, so suppose I create a public-private key pair. I put my public key on my website, so anybody can encrypt a message, send it to me. I keep my private key private, so I'm the only one who can decrypt, right? Okay, suppose somebody encrypts a message, sends it to me. Everybody gets to see the ciphertext, right? So you see the ciphertext. Okay, you see this ciphertext. Could you guess what the plain text might be? You can always try to guess what the plain text might be, but you don't know whether it's correct. How would you verify whether your guess was correct? Okay, how about this? Somebody encrypts a message, sends it to me. Okay, so you got the public key, right? Everybody has the public key. You get to see the ciphertext. Suppose you think, okay, the plain text here is probably either yes or no. Something simple, right? Either yes or no. Could you verify whether it's yes, no, or something else?
Just use the public key.
Use the public key. Encrypt yes, see if it matches that ciphertext. Use the public key, encrypt no, see if it matches the ciphertext. Either one matches, you know what the plain text was, right? And if neither matches, you know it's something else. You can't do that with a symmetric cipher, right? Because you don't know the key. Trudy doesn't know the key. You can't do that. So we'll call that a forward search. You can sort of search through the possible set of plain text messages and see if you can find the correct answer. Now, for a symmetric cipher, we mentioned that you have to have a large number of keys, right? There always has to be a large number of keys because anybody can do an exhaustive key search. So we have to have a large number of keys. That's also true with public key systems. The number of possible keys has to be large, but this says the number of possible plain text messages also has to be large, right? Okay. How do we make the number of possible plain text messages large? Turns out that's actually pretty easy, but you at least have to think about it. Okay, it's something, it's a potential gotcha you have to think about.